When the world's biggest oil reserves became the center of a silent power play, global politics shifted in ways most people never saw coming. Venezuela sits on hundreds of billions of barrels of crude, more than Saudi Arabia, and for decades it was a major prize in the race for energy and influence. But in recent years, a new kind of battle unfolded, one without tanks or jets, fought instead with debt agreements, oil shipments, and strategic patience. In this video, you are going to learn exactly how China managed to gain a powerful foothold in Venezuela's oil sector, quietly outmaneuvering the United States without firing a single shot, and why this matters for the future of global power and energy markets. You will discover how China's long-term loans and oil-for-debt deals built economic leverage that even deep U.S. sanctions could not fully disrupt, how Beijing became one of Caracas's most important partners despite overwhelming pressure from Washington, and how the strategies of both superpowers reveal a shift in how modern rivalry is conducted. You will hear lesser-known facts about the scale of Chinese lending to Venezuela, how oil exports sometimes served not just as trade, but as repayment for massive credit, and why the U.S. response leaned more toward diplomatic pressure than military confrontation, reflecting a new era of geopolitical competition. We will also explain how recent developments, including shifts in oil trade routes and changes in export destinations, highlight the limits of traditional influence and the rise of alternative methods of power projection. As you follow this story, you will begin to understand that global influence is no longer determined solely by military might, but increasingly by economic strategy, financial networks, and the ability to secure resources through calculated partnerships. This is not just a story about Venezuela's oil. It is a story about how one nation used patience, capital, and strategic ties to reshape a long-standing rivalry, and what this means for the balance of power in the 21st century. Welcome to our channel, and if you want more deep insights into the world's most consequential geopolitical stories, make sure you subscribe now so you never miss another explanation that helps you see beyond the headlines. Venezuela sits at the heart of global energy politics because it holds the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, more than 300 billion barrels, surpassing even Saudi Arabia in sheer volume. These reserves are concentrated mainly in the vast Orinoco Belt, a region rich in heavy crude that, with the right technology and investment, could supply energy markets for decades to come. Global powers have long looked at Venezuela not just as an oil producer, but as a strategic prize, precisely because of this scale of energy resources. Oil still fuels most of the world's transportation, industry, heating, and manufacturing, so the nation that controls a huge share of it can shape markets and influence prices. For the United States, for example, Venezuelan oil represents a way to balance global supply, counter manipulation by other major producers, and stabilize markets during crises. Venezuela's location in northern South America, bordering the Caribbean Sea, gives it additional importance. It lies near key shipping lanes and close to the United States and major Latin American economies, making it a pivotal point for energy exports across the hemisphere. Controlling or influencing Venezuela means having a stronger foothold in both regional security and economic flows that extend far beyond its borders. On top of its oil reserves, Venezuela also holds vast natural gas deposits, which add another layer to its strategic weight in the global energy landscape. This combination of resources makes the country important not only for immediate energy needs, but also for long-term energy security and geopolitical leverage in a world that still relies heavily on fossil fuels. Because of these factors, enormous oil and gas wealth, powerful global demand, and a key geographic position, Venezuela has drawn attention and competition from the United States, China, Russia, and others for decades, shaping alliances and rivalries that reach across continents. China's strategy in Venezuela was not sudden or accidental. It was built over many years of deliberate economic engagement and strategic lending that tied Caracas's future to Beijing's interests in energy security and influence. Long before Venezuela became the focus of global headlines, Chinese policy banks and state-owned companies began extending massive loans and investment packages to the Venezuelan government, often on terms that went far beyond ordinary financial assistance. Between the early 2000s and the mid-2010s, China poured tens of billions of dollars in long-term loans into Venezuela, a level of financing that made the country one of the largest recipients of Chinese lending in the entire world. These loans were not random. Much of the money was structured as oil for loan deals, where Venezuelan crude would be delivered to China over a period of years in repayment instead of traditional cash payments. This gave China a reliable supply of heavy crude at predictable prices, while providing the Venezuelan government with funds to support social programs and bridge fiscal deficits. At the same time, China funded infrastructure projects in sectors like communications, transportation, and energy, often executed by Chinese firms under agreements tied to the overall diplomatic relationship. The China-Venezuela Joint Fund, established in 2007 with contributions from both nations, became a cornerstone of this partnership, financing social and economic projects while deepening ties. Over time, Caracas became one of China's top oil suppliers and a major component of Beijing's broader strategy to secure energy resources for its growing economy. This long game of investment and lending created a form of economic dependency. Venezuela relied heavily on Chinese capital, and China secured long-term access to Venezuela's vast energy reserves. The arrangement built a level of trust between the two governments that was unique, and it positioned China as a key power player in a region traditionally dominated by U.S. influence. China's approach was not about quick gains or dramatic military posturing, but about patient diplomacy through finance and energy cooperation, shaping a relationship that could endure political and economic turbulence and giving Beijing significant leverage in global energy politics. China's use of oil for loan agreements became one of the most effective tools in building long-term influence in Venezuela. Instead of demanding immediate cash repayment, China offered large loans that could be paid back with future oil deliveries. This approach solved problems for both sides at the same time. Venezuela received much-needed funding when access to global financial markets was shrinking, while China secured guaranteed access to energy for years ahead. These agreements were structured over long periods, sometimes decades, which tied Venezuela's oil output directly to Chinese demand. As oil shipments flowed east, repayment happened quietly, without relying on international banks or Western financial systems. This reduced Venezuela's exposure to sanctions and external pressure, while strengthening China's position as a reliable partner. The scale of these agreements mattered. Billions of dollars were committed through joint funds and state banks, giving China leverage that went far beyond ordinary trade. Because oil was used as repayment, China faced less risk than traditional lenders, even as Venezuela's economy struggled. At the same time, Chinese companies gained access to oil fields, infrastructure projects, and technical cooperation, embedding themselves deep inside Venezuela's energy sector. These deals also created strong political ties, since maintaining oil flows became essential for both governments. For Venezuela's leadership, China represented stability and long-term backing. For China, Venezuela became a strategic energy partner in the Western Hemisphere. Over time, these arrangements reshaped influence without confrontation. There were no military bases or public power moves. Influence grew through contracts, repayment schedules, and shared interests. Oil for loan agreements allowed China to turn financial support into strategic presence, ensuring future energy access while quietly expanding its diplomatic reach. Each shipment reinforced the relationship, making it harder to unwind and more valuable to protect. This method showed how economic tools could achieve what force could not, gradually shifting influence through patience, planning, and control over essential resources. In contrast to China's long game of economic partnership and strategic lending, the United States adopted a much more aggressive strategy toward Venezuela that leaned heavily on sanctions, political pressure, and economic isolation. Rather than building influence through decades of investment and cooperation, U.S. policymakers focused on squeezing Venezuela's financial and oil sectors to weaken the government's capacity to govern. The U.S. imposed sweeping sanctions on Venezuelan officials, state-owned companies, and entire sectors of the economy, especially targeting oil exports, the main source of revenue for Caracas. These sanctions aim to cut off the flow of money, restrict access to international banking systems, and reduce Venezuela's ability to fund its government and repay debts. Alongside financial measures, the United States also applied diplomatic pressure by refusing to recognize the legitimacy of Venezuela's leadership and supporting opposition figures. U.S. leaders demanded cuts in ties with countries like China, Iran, and Russia as a precondition for relaxing sanctions, and often framed sanctions as necessary to curb corruption or alleged criminal networks. Efforts to enforce sanctions went beyond paperwork. The U.S. Coast Guard and military forces intercepted and seized oil tankers linked to Venezuelan crude, adding an element of physical intervention to economic policy. These actions were meant to choke off exports and prevent sanctioned oil from reaching major buyers, including China. While Washington sought to isolate Venezuela economically, Beijing opposed the sanctions and criticized them as unilateral and illegal, positioning itself as a defender of Venezuelan sovereignty. This clash revealed two very different approaches. China used patient economic engagement and long-term loans to build influence, while the United States relied on maximum pressure through financial and legal tools designed to isolate and weaken its rival. This difference has shaped not only the competition over Venezuela's oil, but also a broader narrative about how global powers pursue influence in a world where economic strategy often rivals military might. China was careful to avoid direct confrontation with the United States, choosing a path that relied on patience, calculation, and quiet expansion rather than open challenge. Instead of responding to U.S. sanctions or political pressure with aggressive moves, Beijing focused on deepening its economic footprint inside Venezuela in ways that were difficult to reverse. Financial support continued through structured loans, debt restructuring, and flexible repayment terms, allowing Venezuela to keep its economy functioning when other funding sources were cut off. This support strengthened China's position as a dependable partner at a time when options for Caracas were shrinking. Infrastructure played a key role in this approach. Chinese companies became involved in oil production facilities, refineries, housing projects, telecommunications, and transportation networks. These were not symbolic investments. They were practical, long-term projects that embedded Chinese expertise and technology into Venezuela's core systems. Each project increased reliance on Chinese maintenance, financing, and technical support, creating leverage that did not require public displays of power. By operating through contracts and development agreements, China expanded its influence while staying within the boundaries of normal economic cooperation. At the same time, China avoided rhetoric that could escalate tensions with Washington. Official statements emphasized respect for sovereignty, non-interference, and economic cooperation, framing China's presence as mutually beneficial rather than strategic rivalry. This careful language reduced the risk of provoking a direct response while allowing Beijing to protect its interests. Financial mechanisms were also designed to function outside traditional Western systems, reducing exposure to sanctions without openly challenging U.S. authority. This quiet expansion showed a different model of power. Influence grew through balance sheets instead of battlefields, through supply chains instead of alliances, and through long-term dependency rather than short-term pressure. By the time global attention intensified, China's position in Venezuela was already deeply rooted, making confrontation costly and ineffective. China became Venezuela's biggest creditor and main oil buyer through years of targeted financial support and energy purchases, giving Beijing real leverage even under heavy U.S. sanctions. For nearly 2 decades, China extended massive loans and credit to Caracas, often tied directly to future oil deliveries rather than conventional repayment schedules. Between 2000 and 2023, Venezuela received more than $100 billion in loans and investments from Chinese official lenders, making it one of the largest recipients of Chinese financing anywhere in the world. A significant portion of these loans was structured so that oil exports served as repayment, a model that ensured China would receive Venezuelan crude in the years ahead in exchange for immediate financial support. Because of this arrangement, China became the primary buyer of Venezuelan crude oil, often importing hundreds of thousands of barrels per day, even as U.S. sanctions sought to isolate Caracas from global markets. Before recent geopolitical shifts, Venezuela sent more than half of its oil exports to China, making Beijing the country's largest export destination and a critical source of foreign revenue at a time when Western buyers largely withdrew under sanction pressure. Even as global pressure mounted, these oil-for-debt ties anchored China's role in Venezuela's energy landscape. This dual position as both lender and buyer gave Beijing leverage that lasted through years of economic turmoil and shifting global alliances, illustrating how financial and trade relationships can become tools of influence in international affairs. When the United States launched a dramatic military operation and captured Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro in early January 2026, the world watched a dramatic escalation in the long-running struggle for influence in Venezuela. But China's response revealed just how carefully it manages its global strategy. Washington's intervention was meant to demonstrate U.S. resolve in the Western Hemisphere and to curb China's expanding footprint, yet Beijing chose not to answer with force. Instead, it issued strong diplomatic protests, condemning the action as a clear violation of international law and Venezuela's sovereignty, and calling on the U.S. to release Maduro immediately and settle differences through dialogue rather than coercion. China's foreign ministry described the U.S. strike as hegemonic acts that threaten peace and security in Latin America and the Caribbean, and emphasized that respect for the Charter of the United Nations must prevail. Beijing's language was firm but targeted toward legality and global norms, aimed at rallying international opinion rather than escalating tensions militarily. At the same time, China made it clear that it would continue to protect its interests in Venezuela, including ongoing economic cooperation, energy contracts, and financial commitments. Officials reassured that despite the upheaval in Caracas, positive communication and cooperation with Venezuelan partners would continue, and that China expected its legal rights and investments to be safeguarded, even amid the new political reality. By responding through diplomacy and public statements, Beijing avoided direct confrontation with the United States. It balanced criticism of Washington with a focus on legal principles and long-term partnership rather than immediate retaliation. This approach underscored China's broader strategy of using soft power, economic influence, and international institutions to defend its position globally, even as geopolitical tensions rise around issues like energy, security, and regional influence. When the United States carried out a bold military operation in Venezuela on January 3, 2026, and captured President Nicolás Maduro, it marked one of the most dramatic shifts in Latin American geopolitics in decades, and the reactions rippled across the world. The U.S. struck key targets in Caracas and announced Maduro's capture after hours of precision strikes, a move intended to weaken the regime and curb external influence, especially from rival powers like China and Russia. China's reaction was swift and unambiguous in diplomatic terms. Beijing's foreign ministry issued strong condemnations, stating it was deeply shocked by the U.S. use of force and describing the military intervention and capture of Maduro as a clear violation of international law and Venezuela's sovereignty. Chinese officials called for Washington to abide by the United Nations Charter, immediately release Maduro and his wife, and resolve disputes through dialogue and negotiation rather than unilateral action. This response was not just rhetoric. China reaffirmed its long-standing position of opposing unilateral military interventions and portrayed the U.S. operation as hegemonic behavior that undermines global norms. Beijing also made it clear that despite the upheaval, it intended to protect its legal, economic, and energy interests in Venezuela, including loans, contracts, and oil agreements that had tied the two countries together for years. While China did not escalate to military posturing or threats, its protests were firm and focused on international law, sovereignty, and peaceful resolution. This diplomatic choice allowed China to publicly defend Venezuela and its own role in the region without directly challenging the U.S. militarily, keeping tensions high but avoiding open confrontation. The situation remains fluid, with global leaders and regional powers expressing mixed reactions, but China's approach reflects a careful balance, asserting opposition to U.S. intervention, while protecting its strategic interests through diplomatic pressure and legal arguments rather than force. Venezuela matters strategically for reasons that go far beyond oil, and its importance is rooted in geography, resources, and regional influence that extend well outside the energy sector. First, the country's position in Latin America places it at a crossroads of trade routes and political influence, offering partners the ability to project economic reach into the Caribbean, Central America, and beyond. Venezuela sits just north of the Panama Canal, one of the world's most vital maritime corridors for global shipping, giving it a geographic edge in trade and logistics that few other countries in the region possess. Beyond crude reserves, Venezuela holds vast quantities of other natural resources that make it strategically valuable. Its potential natural gas deposits, mineral wealth such as nickel and copper, and even freshwater resources give the country utility in global markets that stretch far beyond oil alone. In a world grappling with energy volatility and supply chain disruptions, these secondary resources contribute to Venezuela's weight in geopolitical calculations. For China, Venezuela represents more than a supplier of crude. It acts as a gateway into Latin America, a region where Beijing seeks economic partnerships and influence through investment, infrastructure, and finance. China's engagement with Venezuela fits within a larger effort to fill gaps left by declining U.S. presence in the region, positioning Beijing as a central partner in development and regional cooperation. Additionally, Venezuela has symbolic significance for China's global ambitions. Its long partnership with Caracas shows that China can build influence through economic diplomacy rather than military force, challenging traditional notions of power in the Western Hemisphere. This alternative model resonates with countries seeking development without political conditions attached, thereby expanding China's soft power and strategic footprint across Latin America. Taken together, Venezuela's geographic position, resource potential, and role in China's broader regional strategy make it far more than an oil producer. It has become a key node in 21st century geopolitical competition, shaping alliances and influence across one of the most dynamic regions of the world. China's approach in Venezuela illustrates a larger trend in modern geopolitics, where economic influence can be more effective than military power in shaping global outcomes. Instead of confronting the United States or regional powers with force, China relied on financial leverage, long-term investments, and strategic partnerships to achieve its objectives. By becoming Venezuela's biggest creditor, main oil buyer, and infrastructure partner, Beijing secured lasting influence over Caracas' policies and resources without firing a single shot. This strategy shows that control over capital, trade flows, and development projects can provide strategic advantages that armies alone cannot achieve. The success of this model lies in its subtlety. Economic tools allow countries to gain trust, dependency, and loyalty over time, creating relationships that are difficult to reverse. In Venezuela, China's loans and oil for debt agreements gave it leverage in decision-making, diplomatic alignment, and energy markets, all while maintaining a low public profile. This method contrasts sharply with traditional displays of power, which are often costly, risky, and provoke resistance. Economic influence, by comparison, is incremental, resilient, and multidimensional, enabling a nation to shape outcomes across multiple sectors, including energy, finance, and infrastructure. China's approach also demonstrates a broader global lesson. Modern power is increasingly exercised through networks, investments, and strategic patience. Nations that can provide financial stability, technology, and development assistance often earn political loyalty and access to resources without overt confrontation. Countries like Venezuela, facing internal challenges or external pressures, are particularly receptive to such engagement. This trend is visible not only in Latin America, but in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, where China has expanded influence using economic means rather than military intervention. Ultimately, the Venezuelan example reveals that in the 21st century, money and trade can be as potent as military forces. By leveraging finance, infrastructure, and diplomacy, China has shown that long-term strategic influence can be quietly cultivated and maintained, shifting the balance of power in ways that are often invisible until they are fully realized. The story of China's quiet rise in Venezuela shows how modern power is increasingly shaped by economic influence, strategic patience, and resource diplomacy, rather than by tanks or fighter jets. By using loans, investments, and oil for debt agreements, China gained a foothold in Latin America, secured access to critical energy resources, and expanded its global influence, all without firing a shot. This example hints at a broader shift in the world. The future of international power will rely as much on finance, trade, and long-term partnerships as it does on traditional military strength. Nations that understand how to leverage economic tools and build strategic alliances will be able to shape global outcomes quietly but decisively. In this video, you have seen how China turned patient planning into influence, how Venezuela became more than an oil supplier, and how modern geopolitical competition now operates in the shadows of money and markets. The lesson is clear: influence is evolving, and understanding these shifts is key to anticipating the next moves in global politics, energy, and finance. If you found this video insightful and want to explore more stories that reveal the forces shaping the world today, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. By subscribing, you will stay updated on in-depth analyses of global events, uncover hidden dynamics, and understand not just what is happening, but why it matters.